Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jeff Buxton and Dr. Philip Prins, and the three of us are going to be kind of giving a little State of the Union update, if you will, on Grove City College and the research that they've been doing in their exercise science program. So we talk about the Keto Brick Study that Dr. Prins and Dr. Buxton conducted. We also talk about the ketogenic diet and its impact on human performance. We talk about animal flow and the ongoing research that Dr. Buxton is doing on animal flow. And we even talk a little bit about ankle sprains and shoulder stability and more. So we cover a lot in this episode. It's a very dense episode, but there's so much amazing content in here. I know you're going to love it. Enjoy. Jeff, Phil, super excited to have you both back on the podcast and together this time nonetheless. Really appreciate your time and looking forward to working with both of you today.
Yeah, good to be back, Dan. Thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you.
So for people who might not be familiar with your work, or maybe they missed our past podcasts where we just explored things relating from effective pre-workout supplementation to the effects of ketogenic diet in endurance athletes, all the way up to the effects of quadrupedal movement and animal flow. Would you mind kind of filling them in a little bit about who the two of you are, what you do, and maybe a little bit about Grove City College there for people who, have never heard of that tiny little place in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania?
I'm Jeff, the one speaking here. I am the one interested in anything and everything research-wise, it seems, but doing some work on quadrupedal movement training, specifically looking at animal flow and its benefits, and had a follow-up project from the last podcast that we did that might be cool to talk about. Have another new project coming online with it, and I'll let Dr. Prins kind of talk more about the nutrition related stuff here. But Grove City College, just to kind of fill that part in, Dan, it's an awesome, like you said, little school stuck in the middle of Western Pennsylvania. We're a Christian liberal arts college, but we have a booming exercise science program. And as we were just talking kind of pre-show here, we expose our students to what we feel is a lot of really neat hands-on opportunities that maybe other students probably aren't getting at other undergraduate opportunities. So we feel like we're doing some unique stuff here.
Yeah, definitely. Dr.
Yeah,
Prins?
and so I'm Philip, and Jeff's co-worker, and we, again, as Jeff said, I mean, we do a lot of really neat research here at Grove City College. Most of my research focuses on the effect of nutritional interventions, specifically low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets compared to your kind of more traditional approach, your high carbohydrate diets, on exercise performance, metabolism, cardiometabolic health. And so that's part of it. We also looked at or have done work and continue to do work on dietary supplementation protocols, including exogenous ketone supplementation, but also other stuff in the past, like pre-workouts, caffeine, energy drinks, that kind of stuff. But yeah, as Jeff was saying, I mean, our program is or Grove City is small, but in terms of the research that we do, it's quite big and significant. We feel we do a lot of great work here at Grove City College. It's very novel, very impactful, and we have a great body of students and great department and faculty. So anybody's listening to this who's looking for maybe a place to join and get a great education, get a high quality education, but also maybe come join in terms of the research. Grove City is the place.
And if I can add to that, through our research, we also have a lot of really cool collaborations, which you and Phil probably talked a lot about regarding his research in the last podcast. But so some neat connections that we can leverage for our students' behalf.
Yeah, I mean that's an important point to mention, as we get into the research element here in a little bit, right? Because I mean all this stuff is done as a team. right? It's not just, Jeff by itself or myself, it's a team. And so sure, myself and Jeff, we work, together on a lot of these projects. In addition to that, we have, an awesome bunch of students who help us with these projects. We have Professor Tim Noakes from South Africa. He's a legend in the exercise science and sports nutrition and medical field. Dr. Dominic D'Agostino from University of South Florida, right? I mean, he's very prominent in the whole, keto field. Dr. Andrew Koutnik from the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition. Our team from the Ohio State University, Jeff Volek, his lab, Alex Buga, also from the Ohio State University. So yeah, it's a team approach. It's a team approach.
Yeah, definitely. It really takes a village to make a lot of these, amazing things happen. And, like you said, you guys are kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of different things here. And one of the things I've really noticed from your research and talking with the two of you previously is you're always willing to look to the next thing. And it seems like you never really just kind of stop and accept things for the way they've always been. Is you always kind of look for, what more can we learn here? And that's certainly something I've seen from your research as it relates to the energy systems, right? Historically speaking, we have thought for a long time that carbohydrates are the primary fuel source for activity, whether that be aerobic or anaerobic. And that, we all need carbohydrates for any kind of aerobic or any kind of activity that we're doing, running, lifting, whatever. It all takes carbs. Eat your carbs. I remember growing up and seeing a food guide pyramid that said, eat 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates every day. And at the time, that was all well and good. But, we're looking at a society in today's day and age where chronic diseases are becoming significantly more prevalent. And we kind of have to ask the question as clinicians and researchers, am I okay with someone consuming like 40 to 50 grams of sugar as their intra-workout snack? And what effect is that going to have on the overall effect of their exercise and activity? We know exercise is good, but, we can't just exercise alone and expect all the benefits in the world to follow. We kind of have to pair that with other things like healthy diet and sleep and other factors. And I know you recently published a study that kind of looked more in depth at, the effects of energy dense ketogenic bars. And I believe from what I remember of the study, you compared it to a carbohydrate bar around the same caloric equivalent and looked at the effects of it. So if you could, would you mind just kind of walking us through a little bit of what that study was looking at and how you did what you did and then kind of what the outcome was?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and you bring up a good point. I mean, one of the things I like to instill, in my students is, not to be afraid to challenge, traditionally held beliefs with, within the field of exercise science, sports nutrition, etc. Right? You have to ask the tough questions. You can, there's many doctrines, right, and traditionally held beliefs, right, within the field, and a lot of times, right, we kind of just accept it for what it is and never ask, well, is this really true or not, right? And so we try to, a lot of our research, I think, kind of a quick synopsis is kind of on that topic, right, kind of challenging those traditionally held beliefs.
Real quick,
yeah,
Dan, to your point, and to expand on Phil, what you're saying here, case in point, picking my son up from school yesterday, he had health class, asking him, hey, what are you guys talking about? Oh, we're talking about nutrition, Dad. Oh yeah, tell me about it. And again, he's in 6th grade, so he's a typical boy. He's barely paying attention, so he's uttering some stuff, and he goes, oh yeah, and then they said I got to eat a lot of grains. They said that's the healthy diet, is a lot of grains and no fat, stay away from fat, bad. I'm like, oh, I can't believe we're still seeing this this dogma that's being shoved down innocent kids like my son's throat.
Well, that's the accepted dogma, well, within a nutrition health field. But if we were to focus specifically on sports nutrition, right? That's in order to optimize your performance, right?
Absolutely.
Carbohydrates are essential and a preferred fuel source, right? So, I mean, there's reasons for why the field of sports nutrition has this very high carbohydrate mentality, and we can talk about that later. But sure, for the what we commonly refer to as the Keto Brick Study. So what we did for that investigation is we wanted to compare kind of an acute fueling strategy, a high fat energy bar compared to a high carbohydrate energy bar, but isocaloric. And so what we did is we took these two energy bars. The low carbohydrate, high fat energy bar is known as Keto Brick. So you can go Google it. That's a company by Robert Sykes, a great guy. So you can go Google Keto Brick. You'll get to the web page, right? And you can see here's all the different keto bricks. There's all kinds of different flavors, and it's an energy dense, ketogenic bar. So one, it's about this. Well, people probably can't see me, but it's it's
it's a small brick.
Yeah, it's a small miniature brick. It's 1,000 calories, so it's energy dense. So they go, well, here, this is very novel, right? A lot of people probably haven't heard about this approach. Let's compare it to a high carbohydrate energy bar. In that case, we use the Cliff Bars, right? So a lot of people are familiar with Cliff Bars.
Mm.
So what we did is we got a group. It was a nice sample size, almost 30 recreationally active, college age individuals. And we got them to come in a fasted state. So they come in the morning in a fasted state, and then they would have their breakfast. Okay, their breakfast would then be the Keto Brick or the Cliff Bar, but it would be 1,000 calories, right? So a nice heavy breakfast. So either 1,000 calories of the Keto Brick or the low carb, high fat bar, or 1,000 calories of the Cliff Bar, so the high carbohydrate, energy bar. And so so they would be blinded to this. We would cut it up into small little pieces, put it on a plate, give them some water alongside of it. And they would have about 10, 15 minutes to ingest their, breakfast, so to speak. And so they would do that. They would come in 3 hours then later after they finished their meal. And then they would perform a exercise, basically test to exhaustion. It was a ruck protocol. So we wanted to design the study so it can have military applications. So the time to exhaustion protocol, it's incline ruck. So they would be on the treadmill at an incline, and they would have a ruck. It was 30% of their body weight. So, and then it's, here you go to exhaustion, right? Go until you can't go any further. And at the same time, we're measuring. So we have the med card, so we're doing gas exchange, right, for the purposes of also able to calculate the energy requirement during exercise. So looking at their respiratory exchange ratio, looking at the percent energy derived from carbohydrate and fat, and how that changed with the two energy bars. We also measure blood glucose, blood lactate, and blood ketones, so some of these blood metabolites as well. So that's kind of the gist there of the experimental design. I mean, Jeff, you can say if I missed anything significant. I mean, there were some perceptual measures, as well.
Yeah.
RPE, affect, and fullness, exactly. But that was kind of it. So not too challenging from a experimental design standpoint, but again, pretty neat. Not a lot of studies specifically on that topic. And so again, the results were really interesting. We found no difference in performance. So their time to exhaustion was equivalent on both the Keto Brick and the Cliff Bar, right? Because the idea is, right, the conventional wisdom is, well, it would be impaired. Their exercise performance would be impaired on the low carbohydrate, on the ketogenic energy bar, right? Because it's so low in carbohydrate. And it's obviously mostly fat compared to the Cliff Bar. It's just the opposite, right? The macros are just the opposite, and so their performance was equivocal. I think in both cases they lasted the average time to exhaustion was about an hour on both trials.
What was really interesting, at least to me, and full disclosure, Dr. Prins is more of the nutrition expert. In this field, I'm more of the helper, assister, get the data collected. But what was really interesting is that we saw this equivocal performance outcome and no adaptation period with the keto brick, the higher fat energy bar. Again, but as Dr. Prins was saying, the expectation would be that they would do worse. They didn't, and this equivocal performance occurred without having any significant adaptation period to like a high fat type of diet or protocol.
Yeah, and that's significant. That's a great point, because we've done some studies, and we can talk about those studies later. A couple of studies now looking at chronic interventions when people are being put on a low carb or high carb diet anywhere from about 30 days to 42 days. So basically 4-week to 6-week intervention. So those are obviously more chronic, and this is acute, right? So as Jeff was saying, right, there's no specific adaptation period, right? They weren't keto adapted athletes or participants. They were everybody was consuming their standard diet, in this case just kind of your SAD diet, right? The SAD, right? The standard American diet. So that was everybody's baseline diet, right? Your Western high carbohydrate diet. So again, that's why it was surprising, because they were not adapted. So even from an acute standpoint, the fact that we didn't see that the ketogenic intervention, right, the low carbohydrate intervention did not impair their exercise performance, I think was significant.
Yeah, certainly, because typically, at least based on what I would consider the older model of wisdom here, if we go under the assumption that glucose is our primary fuel source, then carbohydrates should be our main source of energy for activity, when in reality, we can switch to a more fat-heavy diet and cut some of the carbohydrates and still have beneficial effects and no loss of performance, at least as it relates to aerobic activity in this case. And what I find interesting as well is, you go online and you look at the ingredient list for something like the Keto Brick, and I just picked one flavor at random, and you're looking at different raw organic ingredients, you're looking at MCT, you're looking at grass-fed protein sources. Like, overall, it's a very clean looking bar with pretty respectable ingredients. And as a result, I think it's got about 10 or 9 grams of carbohydrates in the entire bar.
Very minimal. Yeah.
The sugar content is minimal to non-existent as well. And when you compare that to, in this case, the high carbohydrate bar that you used in the study, you're looking at close to 70 grams of sugar in the bar itself. And I just can't help but wonder, we were talking about this a little bit off the podcast as well, is, there seems to be a shift in the endurance athlete world lately to a very high carbohydrate approach to fueling, and I just can't help but wonder what kind of health effects that has on people, acutely and chronically for that matter, just because we keep seeing research come out saying that excess sugar intake is not necessarily a good thing. And sure, we have to fuel to match the caloric expenditure and needs of the activity, but should we be willing to sacrifice quality of food for quantity of food in this case? Because as we've talked, there's so many detrimental effects to the high sugar diet, and that just seems to be the shift we're seeing. And with work like yours coming out, it further proves the point that we talked about a little over a year ago with you, Dr. Prins, is it seems like if done correctly, a low carbohydrate fueling strategy can have minimal to no effect on performance. And in some cases, I think I've actually seen a study or two where it shows improved performance.
Yeah. So again, we can definitely talk about those studies, right? Kind of the more chronic interventions and some of the new findings that we have for that. I mean, I would just add one more thing with the Keto Brick.
Yeah.
Before we continue there, because we also measured the metabolic effects as well.
Yep.
As we mentioned, and what that was the other significant finding is sure performance was not different. Again, that by itself is significant or very interesting and novel. But from a metabolism standpoint, on the keto brick condition, their rates of fat oxidation was significantly higher compared, obviously, to when they were consuming the Cliff Bar, the high carbohydrate energy bar. So again, from a metabolic standpoint, lower RER, so indicative of higher rates of fat oxidation on the keto or ketogenic energy bar. So you have those metabolic effects that goes along that we see with the chronic interventions, right? Again, that's not a new finding, but again, that was interesting to see here that even this acute intervention kind of not. I mean, the amounts of fat oxidation isn't comparable to what you see from the chronic intervention, but was still significant. It was still high enough to result in statistical significance.
And maybe before we move on, maybe a quick little plug here. We had some neat stuff happen this year, Dan, which maybe would lead to a follow-up in a year. Like, hey, what happened here? We had a group actually do Keto Brick 2.0 study.
Yep.
And they we're going to continue it. We're going to work through probably the summer, maybe more through the fall of this year to just increase the sample size on that. So it might be a little bit before the results of that are published. But running off of this Keto Brick 1 study that we did, we're now looking at a similar design, but only looking at higher intensity activity. So I believe in Dr. Prins, correct me, Phil, correct me here. We were doing a 5K, right?
Mm-hmm.
So similar design, but now higher intensity effort that we're looking at. And then again, we have preliminary data. Again, so whoever's listening, please understand preliminary data, non-peer reviewed, right? But we're seeing kind of the same story being paved as in Keto Brick 1.
Yeah, that's incredible. And the other thing, I'm pulling up some of my notes on your study there myself, and I forgot to even mention one of the things that I noticed was the session RPE was a bit lower in the Keto Brick group compared to the carbohydrate group, which I find interesting because if I perceive something to be easier myself, then I would imagine I'd be able to do more activity or hit a higher intensity possibly. And the other thing too is the sodium level between the keto and the carb bar was almost identical, because I know some people might kind of look at it and say, because you mentioned earlier that you assessed thirst level as well. Some people might look at it and say, well, what effect did the minerals have on hydration status and thirst and that sort of thing? But it seems like from your methodology here, you kind of already accounted for that with some of those factors being nearly identical.
Yeah, there was no difference in thirst and fullness in that study. But with the Keto Brick 2.0 study, we are seeing a little bit of a different trend, especially when it comes to fullness. So we'll see if that result holds. Again, there's some other interesting things too. I don't know if it might be a little bit too early to get into that, but like Jeff said, it's kind of similar.
Non-peer reviewed findings at the moment. That saves us, I believe.
Yeah, but again, the application here is again no difference in performance, even from an acute intervention, and again, this from a military standpoint. Right, because this is an energy dense bar, right? If you were to look at the overall total weight of the ketogenic bar, it was about 150 grams compared to the Cliff Bar. Because remember, one Cliff Bar is not going to give you 1,000 calories, right? So we had to give 4 Cliff Bars to get that same number of calories. So that was about almost close to 300 grams, right? So it's lighter load, right? So from a rocking standpoint,
taking up less space.
Yeah, taking up less.
Again, small things, but in that world makes a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of want to try this study for myself here just to see if I can consume 4 or 5 Cliff Bars and then, at a separate time consume one of these keto bricks myself here, because I'd imagine it's quite a project to get through an entire one of these bricks here.
Anecdotally, and again, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, from Keto Brick 1, I believe our subjects had anecdotally, like, hey, how did that go? They had the biggest struggle with the Cliff Bar condition, in terms of getting it all down in one sitting.
Right, it's just more.
Correct. Yeah, just that overall gram weight. They're just
the
consuming
overall volume.
more material.
Yeah, interesting. So kind of like as I was alluding to a bit ago, is how do we take this and kind of apply this on a more broad scale or broad sense, or how do we kind of use this in our daily lives? And again, how do we kind of look at this and think about it from the health lens here? And how does, the findings of something like this study that shows or suggests that, a change in fueling approach is not detrimental to performance. How do we kind of relate that from a health standpoint here?
Sure, from a health standpoint, right? Because I mean that the Keto Brick study that you just went over, and again, this was published in experimental physiology, or that's the name of the journal, in February this year. If anybody wants to go look that up, but again, that didn't specifically look at hey, let's look at the cardiometabolic effects and how did this approach impact somebody's health, because it's just an acute intervention, right? You bring people in, hey, eat this, let's see how it affects performance, like a lot of studies with energy bars or supplementation, right? That's just the way it goes, right? So you're asking more about how these different dietary approaches, right, affects kind of more your health in the longer-ish term. And we've done a couple studies now on that. The first study was a 42 day, so 6-week dietary intervention, high carb, low carb, and we did a bunch of stuff. But one of the things we did was to look at cardiometabolic health. We looked at kind of their blood lipid and lipoprotein profile. So if you're interested, that paper was published in Nutrients last year. And so, yeah, so we basically looked at their blood lipids and lipoproteins and see which is obviously indicative of kind of cardiovascular health and cardiovascular risk, and to see how that would be impacted as a result of these two diametrically imposed dietary interventions. And then we did, our latest study was a 4-week, about 31-day dietary intervention, low carb, high carb. And sure, again, we looked at these lipids and lipoproteins. We also looked at some other biomarkers as well. In addition to that, we did CGM, so continuous blood glucose monitoring, which is becoming, pretty popular, and not just among, your clinical populations, for example, individuals with diabetes, but now people who are non-diabetic are experimenting with that technology, including athletes and including professional athletes. So those are the kind of the two studies that kind of addresses your question, and kind of the results. To make a long story short, there's definitely things going on there. These two diets are heavily impacting all these different cardiometabolic biomarkers in very different ways. And so people interpret these alterations and modulations by the diet in different ways, right? So some people say, well, this is not good, and well, this is good. So basically, in short, what we found is the low carbohydrate diet with these, again, the interventions that we've done is anywhere between 31 days and 42 days. Okay. So I can't speak, okay, what happens after, 12 months or 24 months. So what we found, a low carbohydrate diet results in significant increases in total cholesterol and also LDL cholesterol, right? So in the field of, especially cardiovascular medicine, that's typically frowned upon, right? To see increases in your total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. However, there's definitely debate upon, if those are actually useful predictors of cardiovascular disease.
I was just schooled on this recently by Dr. Prins.
So that's its own, maybe separate discussion, but that does happen. And the studies that we've done, we've seen, anywhere from about 20, 30, 40, in some cases even more milligram per deciliter increases. So it's not actually a small increases. Sometimes we see even kind of a big old jump within the first couple of weeks, and then it kind of starts to plateau here at 5 or 6 weeks. But at the same time that's happening, we also see the low carbohydrate diet significantly increasing HDL levels. So that's also going up. Right, that's commonly viewed as, well, that's as HDL goes up, right, your risk of cardiovascular disease goes down. At the same time, triglycerides are going down. VLDL, so the very low density lipoprotein, goes down. So seeing reductions in your blood triglycerides and your VLDL levels, again, that's also viewed as favorable. And then we also look at some of these ratios, for example, like your triglyceride to HDL ratio. Again, that's also been shown to be very, very powerful, predictor of cardiovascular disease. And so seeing reductions in that ratio is very favorable. And so something else we see on a low carbohydrate diet, because of the increases in HDL and the decreases in triglycerides. So therefore, we see that triglyceride to HDL ratio improving significantly on the low carbohydrate diet. So that's kind of a gist of just looking at these lipids and lipoproteins, what's happening. And so obviously, therefore, the question is, right, which, does the increases in HDL, the decreases in triglycerides, the decreases in VLDL, or the improvements in the triglyceride to HDL ratio, etc., does that, for example, does that overturn maybe any negative effects, if you want to even term it negative effects, that you see an increase in total cholesterol or LDL cholesterol? Or does that not even matter, right? So at the end of the day, is your overall atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk increase or decrease? We would argue, based on the predictive capacity of those different variables, that their total atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease risk, right, is decreased on the carbohydrate restricted diet. So that's one thing. And then the other thing that goes to your question that I'll mention is the results pertaining to blood glucose. So sure, we've looked at sure, you can look at somebody's fasting blood glucose, in even their HbA1c, right, their glycated hemoglobin. But like I said, we also did CGM, so continuous blood glucose monitoring, right? So it's a little sensor you put on your arm, and then you have the app on your phone, and you scan your blood glucose, as many times as you want to, right, throughout the day. And that's what we did with our participants. They were tracking their blood glucose, right, throughout the day. And so you can then see for that particular participant, for that subject, right, here's the person's 24-hour blood glucose response. But for that study, that was across 31 days. So now that the study was done, you can see, okay, across the 31-day period, right, here's the average blood glucose, here's the median blood glucose, or the blood glucose variability between the two diets. And you can go look up, if anybody's interested, for that paper. That was also published earlier this year in Frontiers in Nutrition. And that's a huge pape. We measured a whole bunch of stuff, and I think that's a later figure, maybe figure 7 in that paper, something like that. And there's a really nice graph in there that shows you basically the circadian blood glucose, and that figure is really impactful. I mean, it really says a lot when you look at that figure, because you can then see when they're on a low carb diet what their 31-day average blood glucose looked like compared to when they're on a high carbohydrate diet. It's a big difference. When they're on a high carbohydrate diet, the curve was always higher. So their average blood glucose, their median blood glucose, their blood glucose variability was significantly higher on the high carbohydrate diet. So about 15% lower on the low carbohydrate diet. Or put another way, their average blood glucose on the high carb diet, it was close to 100 milligrams per deciliter. So basically, you're right there on that borderline of meeting that pre-diabetic glycemic phenotype. Compared to when they're on a low carbohydrate diet, their average blood glucose was I think it was about 85 milligrams per deciliter. So big difference there.
Two quick points. For anyone who's research nerdy, it's actually figure 9, I believe, is what they're talking about. There's only a million figures in this paper.
Yes, sorry.
So no, yeah, figure 9 is what Phil's talking about here. Phil, what was baseline blood glucose? We found some interesting things with these subjects. Is that correct? In terms of pre-diabetes?
Yeah. So the other interesting point of that study was that 30%, so 30% of that sample, when they were on the high carbohydrate diet, went pre-diabetic. So they met that pre-diabetic glycemic phenotype on the high carbohydrate diet. So remember, these are seemingly healthy individuals, and that's typically how we view athletes, right? I mean, these are individuals who are highly physically active. That's particular sample size. All of them are runners, but some of them are also cyclists. Some of them are also triathletes. They're clocking, many miles on a day, or many miles on a weekly basis. So you go, well, these people are seemingly healthy, right? Because they're athletes and they're highly physically active. But now we're finding, again, sure, there's definitely modulations and alterations happening in terms of their blood lipids and lipoproteins, but there's clearly big differences as it pertains to their blood glucose response, right? Kind of overall glycemic response as a result of these two diets, and to the point where we're seeing about 30% of highly physically active individuals, their blood glucose levels are so high throughout the day that it's meeting that kind of pre-diabetic glycemic phenotype, obviously putting them at risk for developing other cardiometabolic disorders and conditions, obviously including type 2 diabetes. And the neat thing about those studies that we've done is that the diets are actually isocaloric. So they're same number of calories. We also control for training load and also their body composition. So their body composition is not, significantly different. Their training load across the intervention period is not different. So again, that's such an important point to understand, because if there's no difference in their calories, if there's no difference in their training, if there's no difference in body composition, these changes that we are seeing, whether it's with their performance, their metabolism, right, or their cardiometabolic health, their blood glucose, that's diet-induced effects, right? That's diet-induced effects. I would add there that no subject experienced this pre-diabetic glycemic phenotype on the low carbohydrate diet, meaning that 30% of our sample who was basically pre-diabetic on the high carb diet, they reversed that on the low carbohydrate diet. And that we published a review paper on this in Frontiers in Physiology also a couple of months ago. And one part of the paper was looking at the crossover point. The other part of the paper was looking at glucose homeostasis. And what we did, and our collaborator, Andrew Koutnik, he did a great job on this. He was finding some other studies where they also looked at CGM in athletes, because again, there's only about 5 studies like that out there. So we're not talking about a great body of literature looking at CGM and blood glucose responses with athletes, especially over kind of a longer term intervention. What was really interesting when he did that analysis is this finding that we saw in our study, this finding that about 30% or so of highly physically active individuals, their blood glucose is so elevated, they're in that pre-diabetic range. That finding is not unique to us. The other studies the handful of other studies who've also looked at this, they're finding the same thing. And that's in either elite athletes or sub-elite athletes as well. That 30% number seems to hold, or sometimes be even a little bit higher in some cases. And athletes need to know that, right? That's information that's valuable to athletes. They need to know, how is my performance impacted by the diet, but not just how my performance is impacted by the diet, but how is my health impacted by the diet?
Which is shocking to me, Dan, is how many of these athletes didn't even know that they're tiptoeing that line, right? They're not experiencing any symptoms that would, suggest that their health is failing. And not to say anyone's health was failing, but that's just shocking to me. And again, kudos to Phil here. There's only a handful of studies that are showing this, right? So we're not getting on a podium here and saying that this is the case, but it's the trend that we're seeing with this, and it's important.
But yeah, as you're saying, right? What would happen in the long term, right? Because that study was the study was just 4 weeks. It was just 31 days.
Yeah.
And so in just 31 days, basically these individuals, became more insulin resistant, right? Because that's indicative of insulin resistance, right? Their their blood glucose, their fasting blood glucose, their blood glucose during the day was higher. So what would happen at, 8 weeks? What happens at 6 months? What happens at, a year? Right. When you hit the point from, okay, well, pre-diabetes to diabetes, what happens, 5 years later, 10 years later, right? That's the question.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you hit on a number of amazing points there, and I'm just going to try and expand on a couple. You brought up recently about, a lot of athletes don't even recognize, like, hey, if they're in a hyperglycemic state or they're in that pre-diabetic state, even though they're training, they're active, they're hitting, I think the ACSM still recommends a minimum of 150 minutes a week of moderate, intensity activity. And
yeah, they're way above that.
I found most athletes are way above that. And typically when we throw the term athlete out there, we typically, at least in research, I see that looking at high school, collegiate, and then like semi-pro, pro. Like these are not like, 75-year-old pickleball weekend warriors. This is like, someone young and active and healthy that we're referring to here without the presence of comorbidities. And Jeff, I think you just recently brought up the point of, they might not even recognize that they're in that pre-diabetic state. And, you're right, they might not, but by the same token, they might be experiencing symptoms of that, but they might not recognize that. So when we think about high blood sugar, what do we think about? We might think of fatigue or tiredness. We might think of periods of, muscular weakness. We might think of periods where, we're, additionally thirsty. We might think about periods of time where, we have additional infections, or we might see mood fluctuations. And those are all just various effects of that. And a lot of times that stuff is kind of just accepted as commonplace in today's day and age. How often do people just get tired and fatigued because, well, look at all the activity you're doing? Or how often do we see someone get a little bit irritable and we just say, well, you're just hangry. We throw a lot of these terms at it. Or, again, on the immune system side, bacteria, at least from my own experience in microbiology research with the paper we previously published, bacteria tend to grow in environments of sugar. At least from, again, my limited experience. I only have one publication here. I'm not going to claim to be the expert. But, if we elevate our sugar levels, are we potentially increasing our risk for bacterial infections? And that's a hypothetical question. I don't have the answer to it. I don't know all the ins and outs there, but I know that typically when I've seen people in the past that start displaying those signs that end up getting diagnosed with diabetes or pre-diabetes clinically, one of the things they see is an increase in bacterial infections and sinus infections and that sort of thing. So I just can't help but wonder, if those signs are there, we're just not looking at them correctly on a clinical side.
It's like we're numb to some of these things, and as you're alluding to, that these are accepted as the way that they are, right? We don't know any better.
Right. And
well, and sure, also from if you're talking about from a cardiovascular disease risk standpoint, I mean, hyperglycemia, right? If you think of why is type 2 diabetes, if you have type 2 diabetes, right, why is it put you at such a significant increased risk of heart disease, right? Well, because what do you have with type 2 diabetes, right? You have the hyperglycemia, and the hyperglycemia, right, it causes vascular damage, specifically causes damages to your endothelium, right, that inner layer right off your blood vessel, right? So it damages your glycocalyx, it damages the endothelium, it promotes, right, endothelial dysfunction, It promotes a vasoconstrictive state. It promotes a prothrombotic state, a state in which blood clots are more likely to happen. And this is all reasons why, probably as you'll see with people with, diabetes, have such a higher or increased risk, again, of cardiovascular disease and those complications.
And I
for
would say,
whatever it's, go ahead,
go
Dan.
ahead. I was going to say, can we, third time's the charm, go ahead.
For whatever it's worth, some of the stuff that I've lately become interested in and reading, diabetes, prediabetes, hyperinsulinemia, these are drivers of the primary driver being recognized as primary drivers of cardiovascular disease. I've read some people considering it one of the 4 horsemen of death. I don't know who I'm reading that from, but you know what I mean? Like this is, and the moral of the story is that this is happening, can happen very quickly, in the grand scheme of things, if we're talking about longevity, 31, 42 days, that's pretty acute, how quickly that can change. And that is happening in very quote unquote healthy populations who are maybe unaware of some of the symptoms that they might be feeling from this. Therefore saying damage, all of the things that Phil just mentioned, that damage is happening now.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, it is. And I was going to say, taking it a step further here, and maybe even giving you an idea for future studies. I don't know. Maybe we'll have to link up at some point here. This endothelial damage, the clotting effect, and all that sort of thing. I would love to see a difference in, when we look at a patient post-operatively, is there any difference in post-op infections and clotting state and that sort of thing in a patient who consumes a more carbohydrate-heavy diet versus a lower carbohydrate, higher fat, or, if we want to use the term keto diet approach, is there a difference in infections? Is there a difference in that sort of thing? While I don't have any citation for that, when I underwent abdominal surgery a few years ago, I tried to stay away from carbohydrate foods for about 2 to 3 weeks, just kind of as my little biohacker self-experiment thing. I didn't have any issues, but again, I can't really apply that on a bigger scale here because that's a sample size of 1. And, when you're a healthy 21-year-old, you kind of feel like the world is your oyster at that point, you're invisible. But, as we were talking here, I know this kind of stuff is a bit revolutionary. And before we run out of time, I want to get into another revolutionary thing you guys do at Grove City College, and that's Jeff's work on quadrupedal movement. I mean, for a long time, we look at exercise and activity, and we think of sagittal plane movement of leg extension, leg curl, or we think about just simple motions, like you get on this machine, you do this motion, and that's how we train. And then we have concepts like animal flow and quadrupedal movement that take that whole concept and just blast it out of the water. And say, look, plain and simple, the body's meant to move. We need a big movement vocabulary. We need a big movement IQ. And I'd like to take it a step further and say, none of these muscles work in isolation. Even though you teach, calves, they do ankle plantar flexion, and hamstrings, they do knee flexion, and biceps, they flex your elbows. Nothing works in isolation from another, at least in the realm of athletics and human performance. Is, when I see a lacrosse athlete step on the field, they never just use their biceps. They never just use their lats. It's a combination of everything working together. And that's one of the many things that I like about the quadrupedal movement flow and that style of training is kind of integrates everything together, from core stability to ankle movement to shoulder stability. And I'll even give you a little plug there. I've had a few patients with shoulder instability where I use heavy, influence from your approaches to things there, where I get them on the floor and we crawl in different directions and different manners. And believe it or not, their symptoms tend to go away over time. So I know you've been doing some continued work there. So fill me in. What's been the latest development on your quadrupedal movement stuff, and where are you at?
Yeah, no, and not surprised about some of the results that you're seeing there. It's amazing when your hands, your hands have a lot of sensory input. Let's just be honest. There's a lot of communication that, and there's a lot of real estate, let's just say a lot of real estate in your brain dedicated to your hands. And when we interact them with the ground or other objects, but I don't know, I think specifically when we interact in a closed kinetic chain style with the ground, the magic, man, it just happens with shoulder function and integrated, maybe even neuromuscular plasticity changes. So that's a little bit of a leap there, but there's some neat things that happen. People, get your hands on the ground and get connected, right? So we did a follow-up study where it was actually inspired by a colleague of mine, Dr. Sally Sherman down at Pitt, used to teach here at Grove City College. And one of her passion is yoga, and she was really passionate about just exposing yoga as an accepted alternative form of exercise for general recommendations, right? That to meet ACSM, we were talking about ACSM guidelines. And so kind of using that same inspiration, we created a similar design to what she did with her yoga study in 2017. And we looked at animal flow versus walking at a heart rate matched pace there, with the ultimate intent to see what was the typical energy cost of a basic beginner level animal flow session. And what we found is really similar to what my colleague Dr. Sherman found, was that just like yoga, animal flow meets the criteria to be considered moderate to vigorous physical activity. And we did some neat things within that study, I feel, where we were also able to look at the different elements of animal flow. Animal flow is really a type of quadrupedal movement training, right? It's its own quadrupedal movement training system, and it has several elements to it that can be worked into a group style class. But we were able to look at the actual energy demands from each of those elements. And you mentioned the flow piece, right? That flow piece really was pushing the vigorous intensity realm there. I believe, what were we pulling? Almost, I think 7 to 8 kcals per minute is what we were averaging with the flow segment. Anyway, so that was really neat, because now we can even look at those segments, and then from a programming standpoint, if we're looking at programming animal flow maybe to meet some metabolic needs, we might know how much or how little of one segment we might want to incorporate into a group format class, if we're catering to a certain clientele or not. So anyways, that was the last study that we did. And we are now looking into a new project that we're going to get started here, hopefully in a couple of months, where we're going to use a biomechanical approach to look at what's happening with our muscles and joint torques, muscle activations during some of these types of movements. So we're going to use surface EMG, we're going to use motion capture, we're going to use some biomechanical modeling stuff as well.
Yeah, and that's going to be really interesting to see what the outcomes of that look like, because there's this big debate going on right now, at least from what I've seen, where there's biomechanical constructs and there's neurophysiological constructs. And I can't help but wonder, when we talk about things like the flow state that comes with animal flow, or taking it a step further and taking something like an animal flow routine and looking at the effects, maybe in like a 3-4 week time period. I don't know if we have answers to this, Jeff, but typically I think of muscle hypertrophy and muscle bulk and muscular changes like that taking a longer period of time, like 6 to 8 weeks, with the shorter durations coming from more of a neurological construct in improved muscle recruitment patterns and that sort of thing. So I guess my question becomes, do you see, the animal flow as a means and method of improving muscular strength, hypertrophy, and power long-term, simply because the demands are there to produce that response, right? You have loading, you have a lot of weird positions where people are often weakened. You can see improvement over time. Or do you see that as more of like a neurological drive of, again, movement vocabulary, movement IQ, waking certain things up, improving, motor unit recruitment patterns? Or is it really just kind of a combination of both where, we can see some size and strength gain from animal flow, and we're going to see improvement on the neurological side of things as well?
Well, good question, Dan. I think we're definitely going to see things improve neurologically. We are definitely going to see better connection, mind, body, better overall awareness of thyself, right? There's no question in my mind about that. In fact, there's been some studies looking at just simply cognitive function, executive function, et cetera, following animal flow type work, quadrupedal type work, and seeing some really nice results with that, just looking at the cognitive piece. So from a coordination standpoint, I think it's a movement coordination standpoint, it's a definite no-brainer. I think it's going to be a little bit hard to sell to say that if we just practiced animal flow alone, that we would see significant increases in muscle fiber hypertrophy or strength. And again, I think it would scale to wherever the starting point was of the individual. For a newbie, yeah, sure, we'll see some muscle fiber size, we'll see some strength gains, but I do think there is probably a bit of a ceiling. Again, we're a little bit limited by our own body weight. What I see animal flow, though, really, or any similar systems to animal flow, they are going to be wonderful. I hate to even use the word accessory. A complement really is the better term there, because as you alluded to, this is type of training is going to expose gaps and weaknesses that we're not aware of. And I think as it exposes that and influences those gaps, we'll see the additive benefit to our strength and power development. So I would definitely look at this as complementary type of training to fill in gaps.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love how you brought up the point of just overall awareness, because it amazes me how many people lack proprioceptive ability of just figuring out where their body is in space. And that was something we dived into recently on the podcast with Danny Foley in relation to fascia. And the role that plays in giving us proprioceptive input, because we have that fascial connective tissue throughout our body from our spine to our feet. And I would take it a step further to your point there and say that, in a lot of strength and conditioning programs and even personal training programs that I've seen, everyone wants to get all specialized and focused very quickly. I think a lot of, traditional minded strength coaches that I've seen will live and die by something like the barbell squat for football, for example. Big squat, big strength, good power output carries over to the football field. Same thing with the bench press. I see that a lot of times, but ultimately those are pretty specialized lifts. And, we think about just that motion repeatedly. I don't often see football players doing this motion during a game.
Only when the big linemen pile on each other and you got to push them off of you.
Right. But I do see a lot of weird patterns being adopted, whether you're being tackled or doing the tackling or pushing up against someone else or running a route, or, anymore, it seems like the in thing to try and hurdle a guy if you're the running back carrying the ball. And I think there's a value in kind of breaking the mold from what we call like a traditional training model of, your leg day being a barbell squat, a hack squat, a leg extension, a leg curl, and a calf raise, and saying, look, the demands of the sport are you need to get in weird positions and you need to move between them. And animal flow kind of hits that from a just basic said principle standpoint.
Yeah, in fact, I think a lot about sports like football, rugby, even other rotary sports. When you look at a lot of the animal flow movements, it's almost all rotary, aside from maybe a few of what we call the form specific stretches. You're doing these what we call under switches, side kick throughs, and these are all rotary movements that are happening at about 3 points of contact with the ground, 2 points of contact with the ground, sometimes 1 point of contact with the ground. And you're using a shoulder and a leg to slow the rotation of your body down. You're doing a lot of, again, hopefully we'll try to find this out, but there's a lot of eccentric loading that's happening in, as you're calling, the kind of weird positions. These are the weird positions that we get injured in, right?
Yep.
These are the things that we're untrained for, right? This is the worst case scenario. I got caught. I'm really strong right here. And again, I know I'm not on camera, but in my bench press at my 90, I'm really strong here. But how often are we in that position when we're going to take a tackle, when we're trying to drag somebody down? Or again, I'm limiting myself right now to contact sports, but I'm sure we can find examples even in non-contact sports where injury occurs because our body gets out of position, maybe through a perturbation or a sudden loss of balance, and we're in an oh crap scenario that we have never seen. So I think, to your point, Dan, Animal Flow is great at being one of those systems that exposes us to kind of those our myofascial system, one of those oh crap scenarios, but it gives you confidence to be there and go there.
I'm so glad you brought up the point of injuries there as well, Jeff, because I know you and Dr. Prins recently worked together on a publication that hits one of the most common injuries that we see, from a PT side. And we even kind of hit this in detail with Dr. John Gardner, PT with the Charlotte Hornets earlier this year, is the concept of the ankle sprain. I mean, we see that in football players, basketball players, soccer players.
It's never going to go away.
It's extremely common. And yet when it comes to, the injury mechanism, most commonly we see a lot of closed chain supination, I would say, or
absolutely
kind of that combo of plantar flexion, inversion state. And, we treat it in a lot of different ways, from restoration of dorsiflexion range of motion to improving strength and that sort of thing. And, I was fortunate enough, we didn't look at ankle sprains themselves, but we looked at the effect of dorsiflexion range of motion gain after some manual therapy techniques and the impact that had on dynamic balance, which, relies heavily on ankle strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my own capstone. But you guys recently looked at the effects of ankle strengthening on, ankle sprains. So what did you guys find in your work at Grove City?
Yeah. So again, this was a really neat, a student-led project that myself and Dr. Prins assisted on. So, and actually, Dan, what this looked at was we were actually comparing two types of training programs, more of a novel training style versus what we could call a traditional ankle strengthening, ankle range of motion programming. And then we looked at common indices of lateral ankle sprains. And so what we did here is we took, I think we were a sample size of 30, and we separated those 30, and they were NCAA Division III football players. We separated them into two groups, one being this more novel closed kinetic chain supination style of training, versus 14 of these players were in what we would call the traditional style of training. And that traditional style, it was using band resisted ankle eversion, inversion. We did some band resisted hip abduction type work. So that was kind of your classic, what you might find in the literature in the clinic. Hey, we're going to do some lateral ankle strengthening. The novel supination style was really interesting, and I'm going to do my best to explain it here. The inspiration was really, and maybe this will help paint the picture. The inspiration was, can choosing exercises that more mimic the real world mechanism of a lateral ankle sprain, can that improve some of these markers that are usually associated with lateral ankle sprain deficits? So we chose closed kinetic chain supination style exercises. So for one of them, we did maybe your audience can try to close their eyes and imagine this. You're doing a body weight squat, but as you descend into your squat, you roll your ankles to the outside edge, right? And then as you return back up from the squat, you return back to your position. So we supinated as we flexed our knees and flexed our ankles and flexed our hips. We then did we called it a supination style walking, where we would take a stride out, and as we strode out, we would roll to the outside edge of that 1 foot, and then take our body weight on that kind of outside edge in a unilateral stance as we then swung the other leg through and continued that walking pattern, right? So kind of walking on the outside edges. And then, so that was hopefully that paints a little bit of a picture for the audience of what we did for the two conditions. And then we did a handful of measures. We measured using handheld dynamometer, ankle inversion, eversion strength. We measured ankle eversion, inversion range of motion. And then we found in the literature kind of a unique test that has been associated a lot with chronic ankle instability, as well as lateral ankle sprain indices, called a figure 8 hop test. So those were our outcome measures that we assessed. And we had our athletes train 3 times per week for 6 weeks, so 18 training sessions. We had really nice compliance through the football guys. So any football guys that were part of that study, thanks for hanging in there. The protocol was great. The protocol only took no more than 5 minutes. It was one of those things that can easily be added into a movement preparation, a cool down. I mean, you could throw some of these things in anywhere. The findings were that there was no difference. Again, it was one of those neat no difference findings between groups there. So as expected, the traditional program did improve range of motion. It improved eversion, inversion strength, as it should. We found equivocal changes with the novel supination style program. What is kind of left to be answered is, well, would this style of training translate to better, I guess you could say, injury reduction outcomes versus a more traditional style training, like a preventative injury prevention style? So I don't know if we can talk another research group into that as a follow-up study, but that would be a neat next place to go.
Yeah, like a longitudinal thing and looking at the long-term side of it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that I love about what you outlined with this study here, Jeff. I mean, plain and simple, your design is very applicable in the sense that if this only took 5 minutes to administer, you're doing it 3 times a week. We're looking at 15 minutes a week.
Yeah.
You know, I would say most traditional PT and strength and conditioning models meet 3 times a week. And if you're looking at somewhere between a 45-minute to hour session, this is a very small slice of that session to implement onto something that really plagues a lot of athletes.
Yeah,
and, you know,
sure.
if this is repetitive, it can really be detrimental to performance and just long-term career outlook. So very easy to implement. And the fact that it's body weight based, you know, for the most part, you're not telling me you need some special $2,000 machine or, you know, use coupon code Buxton to get, you know, 5% off this $10,000
no
device.
royalties here. It's very low overhead.
Right. So, you know, it can be implemented anywhere at any time very easily. And I think those are ultimately what we see as being the best things, is not just what holds up in the research to be good, but can I even implement it? And, you know, I can get someone to buy into 10 to 15 minutes a week of activity.
Yeah.
If this whole protocol took, you know, an hour a day, then I'd be honest with you, I don't see a whole lot of people following it.
Yeah.
But we're talking an hour a month if we span it out over a 4-week time. So I love that application piece. And kind of like you mentioned on the, you know, long-term outlook here, while we don't have the data to support it, kind of like I mentioned before, I'm a firm believer in whatever you expose the athlete to is where the adaptation is going to come in. So if you repetitively expose them to positions of closed kinetic chain supination, their body's going to find a way to strengthen and build stability there. We don't know how that is exactly in every specific case, but it's going to find a way. So if we put them there, comparing that to, you know, primarily open chain, basic loading, band stuff, I would imagine just the fact that you're putting them in that specific position and kind of forcing them to learn how to stabilize there from a neurophysiological standpoint will be far more beneficial than just our basic sit on a table, 4-way ankle kind of thing. And that's not to say there's not a time and place for 4-way ankle, but it's not necessarily the one thing that's going to take you all of the way there. You know, same thing with, you mentioned some side-lying hip abduction. I mean, if 3 sets of 10 side-lying clamshell changed people's lives, then I would be out of a job. But unfortunately, it's not that easy.
Right.
So,
Right.
you know, we have to take it a step further. And I certainly see a lot of value in the closed chain approach as well, because movement typically occurs closed chain. And, you know, when we think of injury mechanisms for something like an ankle sprain, I've never seen someone sprain their ankle when they're in the air. Maybe I haven't been around long enough. I know I'm a young guy, but I don't see that happening. So I think that the mechanism makes a lot of sense.
Some weird UFC fight or something like that. Where
Yeah, seriously. But as we start to wrap up here, Jeff, Phil, do you guys have any kind of closing thoughts? I mean, I know we kind of hit a lot of different topics, from, you know, your Keto Brick Study all the way up to where you were at with the lateral ankle sprain work and everything in between there. I feel like this was a great little State of the Union for Grove City College here.
Yeah, no, it's good. Dan, we just appreciate the chance to be back on with you, to give a little bit of a State of a Union. I think it's at least very helpful from our standpoint to get it out there, what we're doing. So just, you know, gracias for that opportunity.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Yes, thank you, you know, for the opportunity. We appreciate that. You know, part of our role in academia, obviously, we teach our courses, and we love our teaching. But we love doing research as well, and we like sharing those results, and we believe the work that we do is important and definitely has practical application, right, associated with it, as you've heard from myself and Jeff. So we've done a lot over the last just over the last year. I think we've summarized a lot that we've done over the last year, and we've got some great studies kind of moving forward. I think Jeff, you mentioned kind of what you were planning, kind of the next study with
Right.
the animal flow and the EMG, right? That's going to be really interesting to see what happens there. We're moving on to kind of our next study that we're hopefully going to start to do sometime this summer. Also kind of a follow-up from the previous one, looking at low and high carb diets. This time we're going to increase the duration now. So we've done one study looking at 5K performance, and after a 6-week intervention, and again found no difference in performance. We've done another study looking at 1 mile time trial performance with the 2 different dietary intervention and found no difference. We've done another study looking at basically repeated sprint performance, 600-800 meter sprints. We found no difference in performance. So that's kind of like more higher intensity, short duration endurance exercise performance. And even though the conventional wisdom, right, would tell us that there should be a difference in performance, and that's the low carbohydrate diet impairs exercise performance, because fat is supposedly an inferior metabolic fuel and able to support higher intensity exercise, an idea that dates back 100 years ago, but we're not finding that. So again, that's valuable information again for athletes. But now we're going to move on from those kind of events, from the more high intensity, short duration endurance exercise performance. We've proven that fat is clearly not an inferior metabolic fuel and able to support high intensity exercise. That's not the case. And we're going to look at more longer duration exercise performance. And one of the things, I don't think we talked about this earlier, one of the studies we did, we actually broke a world record. I don't think we talked about that.
We missed the world record of all
Yeah,
things?
we missed the world record. Yeah. I mean, the blood glucose and the CGM stuff, that was obviously, that's really unique and really interesting, just because there's not a lot of studies on that. But one of the previous studies we did or published earlier this year, we actually measured the highest rates of fat oxidation ever recorded in the scientific literature up to this point in time. Yeah. So, and that was the reason why that was so interesting is because that was during the repeated sprinting performance.
So really high intensity.
Yeah, they were going at so the average intensity was 86% VO2 max. So that's 86% VO2 max. So they're doing 800 meter sprints. I mean, anybody who's done 800 meter sprint before, I mean, that's not an easy event. So they did 6 of them. They get a 2-minute break in between. But again, we measured the metabolic effects during these 800-meter sprints, and it was just astounding the fact that because the conventional wisdom is if you're exercising at that intensity, the amount of energy coming from fat oxidation should be 0, but it wasn't. I mean, the group average was about 1.6 grams per minute. That's their rate of fat oxidation at that intensity. But where the world record came in, 30% of our subjects, so 3 out of the 10 participants, their rate of fat oxidation was about 2 grams per minute. So they're oxidizing 2 grams of fat per minute while exercising at close to 90% of their VO2 max. Again, that is unheard of, and that's the that's the world record over there, right? Because the conventional wisdom is it should be 0 or approaching 0.
Correct me if my math is wrong here, but 2 grams of fat, that's equivalent to about 18 calories or kilocalories per minute. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then just so if you want to do it, if they're doing about 2 grams per minute, right, that will equate to 120 grams per hour, which will equate, if you then calculated it back out, so the caloric expenditure from that will be basically about 1,000, like 1,080 kcal. That's the amount of energy coming from that rate of fat oxidation over 60 minutes. That's a lot.
That's pretty tough to beat.
That's a lot.
I think your next world record should be who can sustain it for a full hour.
Yeah, well, so that's the thing. So what we're saying here is, right, if that's then true, which that's what we're finding, extremely high rates of fat oxidation, even at these higher exercise intensities, right? That's enough, that's high enough fat oxidation, and obviously the caloric expenditure that comes from that to fuel your exercise performance, not just in these short duration events, but obviously also particularly obviously during the longer duration events as well.
Right.
So yeah, so there you go. That was the that was the world record, and that goes with if anybody listening to this is familiar with the whole crossover concept, right? I don't know if anybody has taken any kind of ex-phys course before, but if you understand the crossover concept, and that was created by George Brooks and colleagues, I think 1985. That's this idea that as the exercise intensity increases, your rate of fat oxidation goes down and your rate of carbohydrate oxidation goes up. So, and it's saying, well, your crossover point is occurring at about 60% of your VO2 max.
Yep.
So that's just showing this relationship between exercise intensity and substrate metabolism.
For sure.
And so that's the general thought that, well, your crossover point is, for most people and for most athletes is about 60% of their VO2 max, meaning at 60% of your VO2 max, that represents an equal contribution, 50-50 split between carbohydrates and fat for fuel. And then once you go above 60% of your VO2 max, as most athletes do, right, because most athletes are training or competing at much higher intensities than just 60% of their VO2 max. So it's saying if you go above 60% of your VO2 max, the exercise is carbohydrate dependent because your rate of carbohydrate oxidation goes up precipitously and your rate of fat oxidation goes down precipitously. And that's a huge reason why we've prescribed high carbohydrate diets, or have told athletes, pretty much all athletes, to consume high carbohydrate diets, right? Because fat is a so-called inferior metabolic fuel, unable to support higher intensity exercise. That doesn't seem to be the case. Actually, I'll finish with this. One of the other studies we did is we looked at what happens with this crossover point when they're on a low carb diet, and in that study, the crossover point didn't occur at 60% of their VO2 max. It occurred at 85% of their VO2 max, meaning even at that intensity, so at 85% of the VO2 max, 50% of the energy came from carbohydrate and 50% of the energy came from fat. When they're on the high carbohydrate diet, what happened at 85% of their VO2 max? 90% of the energy came from carbohydrate, only 10% came from fat. And this also shows that the studies that we've done is that the low carbohydrate diet actually improves what's known as your metabolic flexibility, right? This ability to use high amounts of carbohydrate and fat during exercise at these high exercise intensities. So we argue for not an impairment, but an improvement in metabolic flexibility with these two diets. And like I said, now we're moving forward, and so it's going to be interesting to see what happens now next. We to see more longer duration exercise performance and adaptation to these diets. We're going to look at the hitting the wall and the bonking effect, right? So anybody who's done more longer duration exercise, right? So bonking, hitting the wall. So there's two different, the traditional thought there is you run out of glycogen, right? So your muscle glycogen stores have run out of, fuel, so to speak. And that's what's causing the bonking. But the other train of thought is, well, you've become hypoglycemic. And so that's kind of a gist of the next study. So stay tuned. We're going to do, it should be a pretty awesome investigation. Again, we're measuring a lot. It's on, well, if you're interested, and if you're listening to this, if you want to participate, if you're a triathlete, give us a call. We're looking for, pretty high caliber, triathletes to participate in this study. It will be 2 6-week dietary interventions, low carb, high carb, and again, we're looking at time to exhaustion while cycling at 70% of your VO2 max. So there you go.
I feel like if we kept going, we could talk all day about this sort of thing, Phil, Jeff.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate your time. I'm going to link to your ResearchGate profiles, which ResearchGate is still a thing as far as I know. And we'll even drop some other links in there to Grove City College. And, Phil, I know you have a booming Twitter presence, so we'll make sure we throw all of those links in the description below. I really appreciate your time and all the insight and knowledge you guys have shared with us today. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Hey everyone, I want to take a second and tell you all about AliRx. AliRx is a at-home food sensitivity and gut health testing panel. You order online and then receive and complete your test at home for food sensitivities. You then receive a custom report online through your member portal, and then receive personalized recipes and supplements that are catered to you based on your food sensitivities. If this is something that interests you, you can check out the link and description in my bio, and you can use the coupon code capital D, capital B, RAUN, capital RX, so D Brawn RX, at checkout to save yourself 20%. Hey everyone, I want to take a second and tell you all about the amazing CTM band. This is one of my favorite products for self-recovery and self-soft tissue mobilization. It is one of the most effective ways I have found to improve the sliding surface mechanism of muscles and soft tissue, simply because it addresses the needs of compression, tension, and movement, all three simultaneously. This was actually formed and started by past podcast guest, Dr. Kyle Bowling. If you use the coupon code BRAWN10, BRAWN10, all caps, you can actually save 10% off your order at ctmband.com. Hey everyone, I want to take a minute and tell you all about some of my favorite fitness products, especially Pure Motion. Pure Motion was founded by past podcast guest Jorge Bonnet, and Jorge founded Pure Motion to mimic the natural needs for human movement. We talk all about this in our past podcast episodes. I love the tools he's developed, and I love the system that he has for approaching fitness and overall human movement. It's a more mechanically sound system at that. If you use the coupon code BRAWN, BRAWN, you can save yourself 10% at checkout from Pure Motion's website. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Brawn Body Health and Fitness Podcast. If you liked this episode, please make sure to share it with a friend, subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes, and leave a review. This way we can spread knowledge and motivation and help reach more people. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.